At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Chikondi. Let's begin. The Critics' Council sat frozen in their seats. Their message to Earth had been unambiguous: surrender or die. Yet the humans had responded with nothing but a cryptic code, one that, after extensive language processing, resolved into a simple image of a smiling human face. A single mocking display, devoid of any context or explanation. Trimin's large eyes, dark pools that reflected the holographic projection at the center of the table, remained fixed on the enormous yellow circle hovering above them. The smile carved into it seemed to grow wider the longer he stared, though he knew that was impossible. The image was static, unchanging, infuriatingly simple. He sat with 4 others around the circular table, representatives of the Phoenix Empire's highest council. Their red skin ranged from deep crimson to bright scarlet, stretched taut over sharp features. Trimin knew his own complexion lent him a perpetually grim look, a trait of his northern lineage. From each skull curved a pair of white glowing horns, their steady light purely biological despite what outsiders believed. His had dimmed over 50 life cycles, no longer youthful, yet far from the pale glow of the truly ancient. The Quinnics expressed themselves through facial expressions, like most sentient species, through the positioning of their eye ridges, the tightening of their jaw muscles, the subtle movements of their secondary eyelids. The horn glow was just a marker of age and nothing more, though it had proven useful in diplomatic situations when other species mistakenly attributed meaning to the light and revealed their own assumptions in the process. Trimin watched as Loxin, the council leader, rose from his seat. The elder statesman's horns were noticeably dimmer than the rest of theirs, casting a softer glow across his weathered features. Loxin moved slowly, his age showing. He turned to face each council member individually, his gaze lingering on each face for a long moment before moving to the next. Finally, Loxin's gaze settled on Trimin himself. The intelligence advisor met his leader's eyes and saw the question there before it was spoken aloud.
"Does any among us," Loxin began, "have any comprehension of what this response signifies?"
The silence that followed was profound. Trimin watched the faces around the table shift through various emotions like water moving across stone. Zinnik's frustration deepened into something resembling anger, his jaw working as though chewing on words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. Alora's calculating expression transformed into something closer to bewilderment, her secondary eyelids opening fully as if to see the problem more clearly might somehow solve it. Hila's concern morphed into what looked disturbingly like fear, her eye ridges pulling apart in a way that exposed too much of the whites of her eyes. But no one spoke. The holographic emoji continued to smile down at them, casting its yellow glow across their red faces, making them all look slightly jaundiced. Trimin felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. As the highest-ranked intelligence advisor to the Council, it fell to him to make sense of inexplicable behavior from other species. He cleared his throat, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet chamber.
"I suspect," he said, "the humans have not taken our declaration of war with the seriousness it deserves."
The sound that erupted from Loxin was so unexpected that Trimin actually flinched. The council leader threw his head back and laughed, a deep rolling sound that echoed off the chamber's high ceiling. The laugh went on for several seconds, long enough to become uncomfortable, long enough that Trimin began to question whether he'd somehow misread the entire situation. When Loxin finally regained control of himself, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, his expression had transformed into something fierce.
"Not taken seriously? My dear Trimin, every species in this corner of the galaxy fears the Quinnics. Every single one."
He began to pace around the table, his movements energized by his own rhetoric.
We have conquered 9 worlds. We have brought 3 distinct species under our banner. Our military might is unquestioned, our resolve unmatched.
He paused behind Zinnik's chair, placing one hand on the head of Logistics' shoulder.
And it is especially true now, in this moment of transition. The old Emperor, may his spirit find peace in the cosmic void, ruled with wisdom and restraint. But his son?
Loxin's eyes seemed to glow.
The young prince brings with him the fire of youth, the hunger for glory that defines a new generation of leadership. He looks at the empire his father built and sees not a legacy to maintain, but a foundation to build upon.
Alora shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming once against the table's surface.
The foolishness of youth, you mean?
She said. It was rare for someone to speak so directly about the new ruler, even in this supposedly private chamber. Around the table, the other council members nodded in agreement. The gesture was subtle, barely more than a slight inclination of their heads, but unmistakable. Even Zinnik, who typically maintained rigid neutrality in all political discussions, allowed his chin to dip forward in acknowledgement. But Loxin's expression darkened immediately. He straightened, his hand lifted from Zinnik's shoulder, and his voice dropped to a register that Trimmin had rarely heard from the normally affable council leader.
Careful,
he said, the word falling like a stone into still water.
Very, very careful with such words, my colleagues. The prince may be young, but he is not naive. His ears extend throughout the empire, into every level of government, every branch of military, every...
He paused meaningfully, his gaze sweeping across each of them again.
Council chamber.
The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Trimmin felt his skin prickle with awareness, an ancient survival instinct that whispered of predators nearby. He found himself glancing at the corners of the chamber, at the subtle air vents, at the communications console mounted on the far wall. How many listening devices might be hidden in a room like this? How many loyal to the new prince rather than to the council? Zinnik cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. Unlike the others, his face had settled into an expression of determination, the look of someone who had decided to address an unpleasant problem head-on.
With respect to all concerns,
he said, his voice steady in that way that had made him so effective in his role,
we may be overlooking the most critical issue facing us.
All eyes turned to him. He continued.
The prince has already declared war. The message has been sent. Whatever we think of the wisdom of this decision, whatever concerns we may have about this mysterious human response, the simple fact remains. Our honor as a species is now engaged.
He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table.
Consider what will happen if we reverse course now. Every species that has surrendered to us in the past, every world that bent knee to our might, did so because they believed in the inevitability of our victory, the certainty of our resolve. If we withdraw a declaration of war because of a single strange image,
he gestured at the still smiling emoji.
What message does that send?
That we are cautious?
Hila suggested, though her voice lacked conviction.
That we are weak,
Zinnik countered firmly.
That we issue threats we have no intention of following through on. That we can be deterred by confusion tactics or psychological warfare or whatever this actually is.
He shook his head slowly.
The damage to our reputation across the galaxy would be catastrophic. Species that currently pay us tribute might begin to question whether they need to. Territories that have remained peaceful under our rule might see an opportunity for rebellion. The entire structure of our empire is built on the foundation of perceived invincibility.
Trimmin found himself nodding along with the others. The logic was sound, even though it led to a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. He had spent his entire career gathering intelligence, analyzing threats, advising on strategy. He knew that Zinnik was right about the mechanics of imperial power. The moment you showed weakness, the moment you blinked first, you invited challenges from every quarter. And yet, that emoji, that infuriating, inexplicable emoji. Something about it nagged at him, a sensation like a splinter beneath the skin that he couldn't quite locate to remove. Why that response? Why not a counter threat, a message of defiance, a call to negotiation, or even simply no response at all? Why go to the effort of encoding an image file, processing it through whatever communication protocols the humans used, and sending back something so deliberately ambiguous?
I understand the concern about our reputation,
Trimin said slowly, knowing he was about to wade into dangerous waters.
and I agree that withdrawing the declaration entirely would be problematic. But perhaps,
He hesitated, then pushed forward.
perhaps we might delay the actual deployment of our forces, just temporarily, just long enough to gather more intelligence about Earth, about humanity, about why they are behaving in this manner.
The other council members stared at him as though he'd suggested they all retire to subsistence farming.
Delay?
Alora repeated, her tone suggesting the word was foreign to her. Trimin pressed on.
Consider what we have between us, the five of us in this room. Zinnik controls the logistics networks that supply our military. Alora manages the commercial infrastructure that funds our operations. Hela oversees the diplomatic channels that coordinate our foreign policy. Loxin directs the administrative apparatus of the Empire itself. And
He allowed himself a slight smile.
I maintain the intelligence networks that inform all of these decisions.
He could see understanding beginning to dawn on their faces.
If we wanted to cause a delay, if we deemed it necessary for the security of the Empire to investigate this situation more thoroughly before committing our forces, there is no one who could stop us. Not the military commanders, who depend on our supply chains, not the civilian government, which operates under our administrative oversight. Not even,
he lowered his voice, the words quiet,
the prince himself, who, for all his fire and ambition, lacks the practical experience to understand how thoroughly we control the actual functioning of the Empire.
The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was charged, electric, the kind of silence that preceded either violence or revolution. Hela spoke first, her voice weak.
You are suggesting something dangerous, Trimin. Very dangerous.
I'm suggesting caution, he replied. I'm suggesting that we exercise the authority we have been granted as stewards of this empire to ensure that we do not lead our people into a disaster born of incomplete information and youthful impetuosity.
You are suggesting,
Alora said carefully,
that we undermine the prince's authority.
I'm suggesting we preserve it,
Trimin countered,
by preventing him from making a mistake that could cost him his throne and our species its standing in the galaxy.
He expected immediate rejection. He expected Loxin to shut down the conversation, to remind them all of their oaths and obligations, to reassert the chain of command that had governed the Empire for generations. He waited for the veto that would end this treasonous line of thinking before it could develop into something more concrete. But it didn't come. Instead, Zinnik leaned back in his chair and said,
The logistical preparation for a full-scale assault on a previously uncontacted world requires approximately 30 to 40 days minimum. If certain key supply routes were to experience unexpected disruptions, if certain equipment requisitions were to be processed more slowly than usual, we could easily extend that timeline to 60 or even 70 days without raising significant suspicion.
Alora tapped her fingers against the table again, a rhythmic pattern that Trimin recognized as her thinking gesture.
The economic impact of maintaining a war footing without actual combat engagement would provide ample justification for extended strategic reviews. I could certainly advocate for thorough cost benefit analysis before committing resources to a conflict with an unknown opponent.
Gila's expression had shifted from fear to something more calculating.
Our diplomacy requires extensive communication and verification before engaging in warfare with species outside our established sphere of influence. There are forms, processes, interstellar regulations that should technically have been followed before any declaration was issued. Ensuring proper compliance could take weeks.
All eyes turned to Luxon. The council leader sat motionless, his ancient horns casting their dim white glow across features that revealed nothing. The seconds stretched out, each one feeling longer than the last. Finally, he spoke.
Intelligence gathering before military engagement is not just acceptable, it is essential, prudent, expected.
He looked directly at Trimin.
How much time would you need to determine the true nature of Earth's capabilities and intentions? 60 days would be ideal, Trimin replied. 40 at minimum.
Luxon nodded slowly.
Then we shall ensure you have 60 days. And may the cosmic void have mercy on us all if we are discovered.
The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Each council member raised their hand in turn, committing themselves to a course of action that walked the finest of lines between prudence and treason. Trimin felt the weight of that decision settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. They had bought themselves time, but at what cost? As the meeting adjourned and the holographic emoji finally dissolved into scattered photons, Trimin caught one last glimpse of that yellow smile. It seemed, impossibly, to be laughing at him. 5 days had passed since the council's decision, and Trimin found himself in the last place he wanted to be, the Stellar Drift, an establishment that catered to merchants and travelers from across the galaxy. The bar was constructed in a style that attempted to appeal to multiple species simultaneously, which meant it fully satisfied none of them. Wooden panels covered the walls, or at least materials that resembled wood, giving the space a warmth that Trimin supposed some found comforting. The lighting was indirect, hidden behind architectural features and filtered through diffusers that approximated natural daylight from a dozen different homeworlds. The result was a kind of universal blandness that said safe and neutral in every language. Trimin sat alone in a corner booth, his posture suggesting casual relaxation while his mind remained completely alert. The device in his ear was barely larger than a grain of sand, sophisticated Quinix technology that allowed him to isolate and amplify sounds from specific locations within the crowded space. To any casual observer, he was simply another patron nursing a drink and watching the crowd. In reality, he was working. This was not his preferred method of intelligence gathering. He had operatives, networks, sophisticated monitoring systems that spanned star systems. But sometimes, the most valuable information came from the least expected sources. Merchants, pilots, traders. These were the people who moved between worlds, who heard rumors in one system and carried them to another, who saw patterns that official channels missed. The booth's placement gave him a clear view of the main bar, where species of various types mingled with the careful politeness of people who had learned that showing teeth could mean either friendliness or threat depending on one's biology. His drink sat untouched before him, some local concoction that was supposed to be universally palatable and was therefore nearly tasteless. He adjusted the device's focus, scanning through conversations. Most were mundane, complaints about shipping delays, discussions of commodity prices, gossip about romantic entanglements that crossed species lines. Nothing useful. Then his attention caught on two figures at the counter. Both were scaled, what humans would recognize as vaguely reptilian, but clearly from different species. The elder of the two had broader shoulders and deeper green coloring, while the younger was more slender, with scales that showed hints of blue at their edges. They were drinking something that steamed in their glasses, and their body language suggested the easy familiarity of long association. Trimmin refined the device's focus, bringing their conversation into sharp clarity.
Telling you this is my last visit to this place,
the older merchant was saying. He took a long drink from his glass, savoring it with the air of someone committing the taste to memory.
I've been coming here for 12 cycles, ever since they opened this planet to independent traders. But no more. The critic system has become toxic for business.
The younger merchant made a dismissive gesture with one clawed hand.
You're being dramatic again, Killos. Just because they've declared war on some backwater planet doesn't mean...
It means everything,
Kellos interrupted, his voice dropping to a more serious register.
You are young. You don't remember the last time the Quinix went to war. The trade disruptions, the security concerns, the way normal business just stops while everyone waits to see which direction the military moves.
He took another drink, emptying his glass and signaling for a refill.
I'm drinking and eating everything I can today because I love this place, but I'm not fool enough to risk being here when things escalate.
The young merchant, whose name Trimmin hadn't caught, shook his head.
You're overreacting. So they declared war. They've done it before. They'll win quickly like they always do. Things will stabilize and we'll all go back to business as usual. There's no reason to stop coming to a profitable route just because of some minor military action.
Trimmin leaned forward, his interest sharpening. The younger merchant's confidence was interesting. It suggested that the broader galactic community saw Earth as an insignificant threat. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Kellos received his refill and took a long moment before responding. When he did, his voice had changed, taking on the tone of someone sharing information they shouldn't have.
Let me tell you something I heard. Something that's been going around the shipping lanes for the past few days.
The younger merchant leaned in, recognizing the shift in tone.
Even the space pirates are avoiding Quinix ships now,
Kellos said quietly. There was a pause. Then the younger merchant laughed.
Now I know you're making things up. Pirates avoid no one. That's what makes them pirates. I'm serious,
Kellos insisted.
The crews I've talked to, the independents who hear things from the less reputable corners of the galaxy, they're all saying the same thing. The pirate fleets, the ones that usually love to target Quinix cargo vessels because they're so well stocked, they're giving them a wide berth. Why would they do that?
Kellos lowered his voice even further. Trimmin had to increase the device's sensitivity to continue hearing clearly.
Because they're afraid of being caught as collateral damage when the humans retaliate.
The younger merchant set down his glass with more force than necessary.
What are you talking about? What does humanity have to do with pirates avoiding Quinix ships? The war hasn't even started yet. Exactly my point,
Kellos said.
The war hasn't started, but everyone who knows anything about humans is already changing their behavior. Do you know why?
The younger merchant shook his head.
Because of what happened the last time someone attacked Earth,
Kellos said.
And the time before that, and the time before that.
He began counting on his claws.
The Zorath people tried to establish a mining operation on Earth's moon without permission. They sent 3 ships. None of them came back. The official report said equipment malfunction, but I knew a pilot who was in that sector. He said the Zorath ships were torn apart by weapons platforms that appeared out of nowhere. That's just... The Keltharian swarm attempted to harvest Earth's oceans for genetic material. 45 vessels entered Earth's atmosphere. 23 were destroyed immediately. The rest were captured, and the Keltharians were sent back with a message carved into their breeding queen's carapace, in their own language. A message that said, "Next time we keep you."
The younger merchants had stopped objecting. Trimmin realized he had stopped breathing.
The Vrex dynasty,
Kellos continued,
decided Earth would make an excellent agri-world and sent a colonization fleet, scouted, mind you, by their legendary admiral. 200,000 colonists ready to settle on Earth. Do you know what happened to them?
Silence.
Nothing.
Kelos said.
They arrived in Earth's system, and then they simply disappeared. No distress signal, no debris field, no trace. The Dynasty sent 3 separate investigation teams. All 3 teams also disappeared. Eventually, they just stopped trying. To this day, no one knows what happened to those ships.
He drained his glass again.
So when I say that even pirates, who fear nothing and respect no one, are avoiding being near Krennic's ships, I'm not being dramatic. I'm being smart. Because whatever the Krennics are about to unleash, whatever war they think they're starting, the people who actually know about humanity are treating it like it's already over. And the Krennics lost.
The younger merchant stared at his elder colleague for a moment.
If that's all true,
He said slowly.
why hasn't anyone warned the Krennics?
Kelos laughed, but there was no humor in it.
You think anyone has survived telling the Krennics that they might lose a war? They don't accept warnings. They don't acknowledge doubt. They conquer or they die trying. That's their entire culture.
He stood up, leaving payment on the table.
Which is exactly why I'm leaving before this whole planet becomes a memorial to Imperial hubris.
Trimmin sat frozen in his booth long after the 2 merchants had departed. The device in his ear suddenly felt very heavy, as though the weight of what he'd just heard had given the tiny piece of technology physical mass. The depth of the hole their prince had dug for them was becoming terrifyingly clear. 2 more days had passed, and the Krennic's council sat in their chamber once again, but this time no holographic display showing emojis floated above their table. This time, they simply looked at each other in a silence that communicated more than words could have. Trimmin was certain, looking at their faces, that each of them had spent the past week gathering intelligence just as he had. The subtle signs were there, the tension in Zinnik's jaw, the calculation behind Alora's eyes, the profound worry etched into Hila's features, the exhaustion radiating from Loxin's entire posture. They had all learned things they didn't want to know. Finally, Loxin gestured for them to begin.
Share what you've discovered,
he said simply. Alora went first.
The war declaration has been an unmitigated disaster for our economy. In the 7 days since it was issued, we've seen a 20% decline in interstellar trade with Krennic systems. Merchants are canceling contracts. Shipping companies are rerouting their vessels to avoid our space. 3 major trading partners have formally suspended commercial relations pending resolution of current military matters.
She paused.
We haven't fired a single shot, and our economy is already beginning to collapse.
Zinnik nodded grimly.
The logistic situation is even worse. Our supply chains across the galaxy are falling apart. The mining operation in the Keltar system has suspended shipments because their transport companies refuse to enter Krennic space. The manufacturing facilities on Boros can't get raw materials because the suppliers are experiencing unexpected delays. We have military contracts that can't be fulfilled because the component manufacturers are suddenly claiming force majeure clauses based on predicted wartime disruptions.
He spread his hands on the table.
The Empire's infrastructure is being disconnected from the galactic economy, and the war hasn't even started.
Hila's report was perhaps the most damning.
From a diplomatic perspective, we have become pariahs overnight. Species that we've had friendly relations with for generations are not returning our communications. Alliance partners are invoking technical clauses to suspend mutual defense agreements. I've received 7 formal inquiries from tributary states asking about contingency arrangements should the current situation become untenable.
Her voice shook slightly.
They're preparing to abandon us, species we conquered,
Species that should fear us are already positioning themselves for a post-Phoenix galaxy.
Loxin waited for her to finish, then rubbed his eyes with both hands.
The industrial leaders have been flooding my office with demands. They want the war called off. They want assurances that trade will resume. They want protection for their assets and their workers.
He looked up, and Trimmin was startled by how much the council leader seemed to have aged in just 7 days. His horn glow seemed dimmer than ever.
I haven't slept a full night since we sent that declaration. Every few hours, someone else contacts me with a new crisis, a new disaster that hasn't even happened yet, but that everyone is certain is coming.
All eyes turned to Trimmin. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of what he was about to say settling onto his shoulders.
I've spent the past week listening, he began, listening to merchants, to pilots, to traders, to the people who move through the galaxy carrying information like pollen between flowers. And I've heard stories.
He paused, making sure he had their complete attention.
Stories about what happens to species that attack Earth. Stories that, if even half are true, explain why the entire galactic community is responding to our war declaration like we've just announced our own extinction.
He recounted what he'd heard from Kelos, and then shared other stories he'd gathered from different sources. Tales of the Syraxian Armada, 12,000 warships strong, that had attempted to subjugate Earth and had been reduced to scattered debris within hours. Accounts of the Nethros, master geneticists who had tried to harvest human DNA and had been returned to their homeworld as unrecognizable biomass with a note that read simply, "These belong to you." Rumors of advanced artificial intelligences that had attempted to hack Earth's networks and had been traced back to their origin points and systematically destroyed, along with every server farm and data center they'd ever touched.
But the most telling thing, Trimmin continued, is not the stories themselves. It's who's telling them. These aren't wild tales from unreliable sources. These are accounts from merchants who were in those sectors, from military personnel who investigated the aftermath, from diplomatic corps members who handled the fallout, and the universal response from everyone who knows anything about humanity is the same. Stay away.
He paused, his gaze moving from face to face around the table.
Even the pirates, beings who live outside all laws, who respect no authority, who fear virtually nothing, are avoiding our ships, not because they're afraid of us, because they're afraid of being too close to us when the humans respond.
The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the room. Finally, Trimmin voiced what they were all thinking.
We are going to have to do something about the prince.
The reaction was immediate. All 4 council members looked around the chamber as though enemy soldiers might materialize from the walls. Hila actually stood halfway up from her seat before remembering herself and sitting back down. Loxin held up a hand for silence, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet.
Those words, Trimmin. Such words could see us executed. I know,
Trimmin replied, keeping his own voice low.
But look around this table. Look at what we've all discovered. Our economy is failing. Our logistics are collapsing. Our diplomatic position is untenable. Our people are afraid. And the war hasn't even begun.
He leaned forward.
We are the Council. We are the ones who are supposed to protect the Empire. Especially, when it means protecting it from the Emperor himself.
He waited for the dissent, for the arguments, for someone to stand up and call him a traitor. But no one did. Instead, Zinnik nodded slowly. Alora's expression hardened into determination. Gila looked terrified, but didn't object. And Loxin simply stared at Trimmin for a long moment before taking a deep breath. "Then it is decided," the council leader said quietly. "We will do something. We simply need to determine what." The meeting ended there, with that simple, terrible commitment hanging in the air between them. Just one day had passed, but it felt like a lifetime. The council, through channels both official and decidedly unofficial, had managed to arrange a meeting with Earth's ambassador. The speed with which the humans had agreed to the meeting was itself interesting. Either they were very eager to discuss the situation, or they didn't consider the Quinix enough of a threat to require lengthy diplomatic preparations. Trimmin suspected it was the latter, and that thought made his stomach churn. They had agreed to meet in human territory, on a neutral station at the border of Earth's sphere of influence. The Council had taken a small civilian transport, deliberately leaving behind all military escort, all symbols of power and authority. They were coming as supplicants, though the word tasted bitter in Trimmin's mind. The docking procedure had been unremarkable. The station was modern but unpretentious, built for function rather than impression. They had been directed to a conference room in a business district, a location that seemed almost insultingly casual for what was potentially a matter of galactic war. The humans were waiting for them. The ambassador, a middle-aged male who introduced himself simply as George, stood flanked by 6 soldiers in light combat armor. The soldiers' weapons were holstered but visible, a reminder that for all the diplomatic niceties, this was still a meeting between potential enemies. The Quinix Council entered the room, and what happened next violated every protocol of formal introduction that Trimmin had ever learned. Without preamble, without greeting, without any of the ritualistic exchanges that should precede such a meeting, Loxin and Zinnik dragged forward a figure whose face was covered by a dark cloth. The figure struggled weakly, and even through the covering, Trimmin could hear ragged breathing and what might have been soft whimpering. The human's posture changed immediately, hands moving toward weapons, faces hardening. The Quinix threw the covered figure onto the floor at George's feet. The impact wasn't gentle, and the person, because it was clearly a person, clearly Quinix based on their build and coloring, curled into themselves with a sound of pain. "What is the meaning of this?" George demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion and anger. Trimmin stepped forward, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone in the room could hear it. He reached down and grasped the covering, and with a single motion ripped it away. The prince lay exposed on the floor. Or rather, what had been the prince. The young ruler's face was a mass of bruises, purple and black against red skin. One eye was swollen completely shut. Several teeth were visibly broken, giving his gasps for breath a whistling quality. Blood had dried in tracks from his nose and the corner of his mouth. His royal garments, usually immaculate, were torn and stained. He looked like he had been beaten for hours. Because he had been. Trimmin had not participated in that part of the plan. He had been spared the actual violence, tasked instead with preparing the diplomatic approach. But he knew what had happened in the secure facility where the council had taken the prince after his guards had been dealt with. He knew that each council member had taken their turn, had made certain the prince understood the gravity of what he had done, had impressed upon him, physically, the consequences of youthful arrogance. Looking at the broken figure on the floor, Trimmin felt a complex mix of emotions. Satisfaction that they had acted, horror at what they had done, fear about what it meant for their species, and underneath it all, a desperate hope that this would be enough. Trimmin placed his foot on the prince's back, not gently. "Apologize," he commanded, his voice carrying all the authority of his position, all the fury of the past week. "Apologize to these humans, and make it convincing enough that they will not demand more than your life for peace." The prince began to speak, his voice broken and wet with blood. Words of apology tumbled out, mixed with sobs and pleas for mercy. He begged forgiveness for his arrogance, for his foolishness, for declaring war without understanding the enemy. He offered himself for execution if it would satisfy human honor. He groveled in a way that no Quinix ruler had ever groveled, reducing himself from emperor to beggar in the space of a single desperate monologue. Trimin kept his foot in place, watching the humans' faces for their reaction. This was the moment everything balanced on. Would they accept the offering? Would they demand more? Would they see this as sufficient restitution or an insult that required further violence? What Trimin did not expect was for Ambassador George to step forward quickly, to reach down and actually help the prince to his feet, to steady him as he swayed unsteadily. "Stop!" George said firmly, his hands supporting the prince's shoulders. "Stop hitting your head against the floor. This isn't needed. None of this is needed." The council members froze. Trimin felt his foot slide from the prince's back as confusion washed over him. The humans were supposed to be angry. They were supposed to demand recompense. They were supposed to accept the prince's abasement as the price for peace. They were not supposed to show him kindness. George guided the prince to a chair, his movements gentle despite the combat armor he wore. One of the soldiers, a female with medical insignia, stepped forward and began examining the prince's injuries with professional detachment. George looked at the council members with an expression that seemed to age him several years in an instant. "Gentlemen, I need to explain something, and I apologize in advance because this is going to sound absurd." He took a deep breath. 7 days ago, Communications Station 5 had a brief incident. Operator Laura was on duty monitoring diplomatic channels when her daughter, her 6-year-old daughter, was visiting the station on a school field trip. The girl apparently accessed her mother's console during a bathroom break and, well, she sent an emoji. Just playing around the way children do with communication devices they don't understand. The silence in the room was absolute. George continued, a smile on his face. "We only found out about it today, when your request for this emergency meeting came through and we started investigating what might have prompted it. We traced back through our communications logs, found your declaration in the archives, and then found the outgoing transmission that we now realize was sent in response." He gestured helplessly at the emoji still floating in the hologram. "That was not an official response from Earth. That was a child playing with her mother's computer and accidentally sending a picture through a diplomatic channel she didn't know was open." Trimin felt something fundamental break inside his mind. All the intelligence gathering, all the terrifying stories, all the economic collapse and diplomatic isolation, the beating of their prince, the coup they had just committed against their own government, the treason they had just enacted. All of it because of a 6-year-old human child who had pressed the wrong button. The prince, despite his injuries, made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. The council members simply stood frozen, their faces cycling through expressions too complex and contradictory to name. George, to his credit, maintained his diplomatic composure. "I want to assure you that Operator Laura has been reprimanded. Additional security protocols have been implemented, and we are absolutely not at war with the Quinix Empire. We have no hostile intentions toward your people. We didn't even know you'd declared war until about 3 hours ago." He paused. "Though I have to say, your intelligence network is apparently terrifying if you manage to scare yourselves this badly based purely on rumors." Trimin thought about Kellos the merchant, about the stories of vanished fleets and destroyed armadas, about pirates avoiding Quinix ships out of fear of human retaliation, about an entire sector of the galaxy responding to their war declaration like they had just signed their own death warrant. Had any of these stories been true, or had humanity's reputation been built on misunderstandings, accidents, and the kind of exponential fear that spreads through a galaxy when no one actually knows what they're talking about? Had the Zorath mining ships actually been destroyed by human weapons, or had they simply disappeared for other reasons that became attributed to human action through the power of assumption and fear? He would never know, and in a way, That was the most terrifying realization of all, that humanity's greatest weapon might not be their technology or their military might, but simply the fact that nobody knew enough about them to separate fact from fiction, and so everyone assumed the worst. The prince was being helped to his feet by the human medic, who was treating his injuries with supplies from a medical kit. George was already talking about formal diplomatic channels, about establishing proper communication protocols, about ensuring this kind of misunderstanding never happened again. And Trimmon stood there, a high-ranking member of a coup that had overthrown their emperor because a child had sent an emoji, and realized that they would somehow have to return home and explain this. They would have to face the industrial leaders demanding answers, the tributary states preparing for independence, the merchants who had fled their space, the pirates who had altered their routes. They would have to explain that the great war they had prepared for, the extinction-level threat they had mobilized against, the existential crisis that had justified beating their own ruler into submission and committing treason against the crown, had been nothing more than a communication error caused by a 6-year-old's curiosity. Trimmon thought about how he would write this intelligence report, how he would document the greatest failure of analysis in his career, how he would explain to future historians that the Quinix Empire had nearly collapsed, not because of human military superiority, but because they had scared themselves into paralysis based on children's stories told by merchants in bars. The cosmic void, he thought distantly, had a cruel sense of humor.